Working. Here we go. Let's see if the sound is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm John Miglosh for the WDMA. We're going to go international news today. Hang on to your hats. Sometimes I do news, because it's just good background, and there's a really good direct mail article that I'm going to cover at the end. Not because it's new news, but because it's a really good compilation of how it kind of all fits together and can work together. And I wrote to Kylie to see, she's the author for biz.com, to see what's her background. How did she figure all this stuff out? Because it's really, really well done. It's about a 15-minute read, so it's a long article. But before we get there, we've got a couple of things to cover. And, I was going to do a silly commercial, but I think I'm just going to go right with the news because you know how that is. There's the silly commercial that I'm not going to do today because we just got too much to cover. And the style consultant gets upset with me when I throw in an extra minute or two. So Tories pledge business and consumer-friendly GDPR, okay? And replacement for GDPR. Okay, Michelle Donnellan says that they're going to replace GDPR, and Print Week says this is good news for the printing industry. Okay, and so she gave a speech on Monday and said that our plan will protect consumer privacy and keep their data safe whilst retaining our data adequacy so businesses can trade freely. And of course, there's principles in law like my freedom of expression ends at the end of your nose. In other words, I can punch the air all I want. It's my freedom to express myself in crazy ways. But if you're right there, I can't punch you in the nose, right? So, there are limits to everything. And it's really hard to get these limits adjusted properly. I think part of the fight is about the idea that we need data to personalize customer experience. But of course, if you have to ask 7 times about whether you are okay with us using your data, or other hoops that you might have to jump through, well, that's going to ruin the customer experience. So, it's a tough balance. It's hard to see in the regular e-commerce world. In my experience in 40 years, I haven't seen abuses of data. I haven't seen abuses of data like this is not, most of us are just collecting it up and hoping not to waste a $1, $2 mailing. That was the motivation behind most of our modeling. Most modelers would say, well, I can cut the waste in your modeling, but when I told Dick Cabela I could cut 20% of his mail and only cut 5% of his sales, and granted, we could reinvest it and probably make up the difference. But I was young and foolish, and I didn't understand. And he said, I don't want to cut 5% of my mailing. I want to grow. So don't tell me how to cut. Tell me how to grow. And the answer is a blend of the two. There's junk in the mailing that that people haven't bought from you in a long, long time and weren't really very high potential when they did. And you mailed them and mailed them and mailed them, and maybe you shouldn't have. We just worked with America's oldest catalog, continuously running catalog for a couple of years, and one thing we found was that their digitally acquired fourth quarter names were not worth mailing first quarter. We found them mailable fourth quarter again, but not through the year. It didn't make any sense. They were gift givers mostly, and they were Christmas gift givers or holiday season gift givers. So anyway, this balance between consumer privacy and safe data and the great insights of customer experience. Most of the things consumers want pre-data explosion are the same. They want to be able to order. They want to have a choice of quality merchandise, good value for their money, and gets there. Company they can trust to get it there. And those are the main 3 things that people want. And Personalization, yeah, maybe that's icing, but most of the time, or at least half the time, you get it wrong anyway. So even the effort at personalization can backfire. So anyway, but they're making big promises. This was one of the most interesting lines in the 3 articles that I'm going to talk about. And this is again, Donnellan. What was her first name? Michelle. This is Michelle saying, she says, even though we have shortages of electricians and plumbers, GDPR ties them in knots with clunky bureaucracy. I would love to hear from somebody in the UK about how GDPR affects electricians and plumbers. It's really interesting, I mean, I know that the privacy legislation and the use tax legislation, or the removal by the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy will never be forgiven in my book for that, of something that was clear and enforceable and everybody knew understood it, to change that to 12,000 sales taxing jurisdictions. Companies continue to wrestle with that and really, really have not got a solution for it. And thankfully, the bureaucracies haven't come after most of us yet. But it's impossible. It's impossible to satisfy it. Theoretically, any taxing jurisdiction in the country can come and audit your business. We need protection from that. But anyway, it just shows you that governments can destroy businesses. And so I'd like to know how they're wrecking the plumbers and the electricians. Anyway, we will look to those countries who achieve data adequacy without having GDPR, like Israel, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and New Zealand. And some of the issue, with CCPA in California, consumers can sue your company, even out-of-state companies, and if you mail into California, I remember probably in the 90s when New York changed its laws for list rental and made it sales taxable and made it very, very complicated to operate a list management company, and they just all moved out of New York. So I don't know how companies are handling the potential liability of California's what would be litigious? That's a good word. Litigious happy citizenry. Okay, but the UK says they're going to look to these countries who they think have it figured out. And that's one of the benefits of not having a new world order and a one world government. Each country can take different approaches, and obviously the societies are different. Their propensity to engage in legal shenanigans may be less. I understand the United States has more lawyers per capita than any other country in the world, probably because we have a system of law that allows anybody to sue, and groundless or not, it ties you up. New Zealand, I know, is one of the most interesting. That I don't think you can sue unless you've been in the country for something like 6 months or something, and they won't get to it for another 6 months. So you have to stay in New Zealand for a year to even bring a suit. And they're just, they just have the philosophy that, if you jump off a cliff and get killed, your heirs or your relatives don't have the right to sue the people who own the cliff or the helmet that didn't save your life or whatever else. That's why New Zealand has a lot of bungee jumping and whitewater rafting and all kinds of fun stuff, because you sign a thing that says it's my fault if I get killed, which it is. It's always been, and it's going to be, even if you live in California. But it does take the fun out of a lot of stuff, So anyway, we better not get too far. So anyway, the print industry is fairly optimistic. We watch with interest as the Secretary of State has said that GDPR is not fit for purpose, and she repeated that phrase several times, and I'm sure it's true. We had many mailers who decided not to mail much in the UK, or especially not prospect anymore, mail to their customers. I feel, and this is from Phil Newton, okay, And Phil says, I feel, who's chairman at PSE Offline Marketing, offline, that's probably printing. I feel this could be a great thing for the UK print and mailing industry, mostly because of the fear factor created by GDPR. There were so many scare stories when it was being introduced. Yeah. And one of the biggest mailers in the UK, I think the biggest mailer, deleted everybody that was older than a 12-month buyer. It stopped a lot of companies from using direct mail completely. And then the mailers got together and said, hey, we've been mailing for 40 years. There's no problem. If a customer says they don't want to get it anymore, we tell them, okay, we won't. And it's all well managed. And the Grand Inquisitor General or whatever, it's a really cool title what they have there, to enforces it, said, yeah, that makes sense. So the list, everybody had these terrible articles about how the list industry was going away, the mailing was going away, everything. Actually, GDPR had very little to do with mail, but some people thought it did. While carefully targeted DM has always been a great way to recruit, train, and win back customers, it was one of the best ways to reach out and win back old customers because it wasn't specifically cited. Whereas if you had a customer that, after 2 years, I think, they didn't buy again, if you emailed them, that was a violation of GDPR. The GDPR specter, this is the most important part. The specter hanging over countries being removed can only be a positive thing for companies. Contingent liabilities are a serious thing, and especially when it's all settling out. And I think California is doing great harm to the country because they pass these laws and just like throw them out there and say, well, this looks good. This will protect people. Right. But at what cost? Anyway, so this is a less optimistic story of the same thing from Dan Meyer, and he's got lots of industry experts that basically say, it's nice that Michelle Donlan announced no longer will our businesses be shackled by lots of red tape, but basically everybody in here says that, GDPR is a mess. James Roswell said IAB Europe tried to untangle some of that complexity for advertisers with its transparency and consent framework. They tried to give consumers a framework where they told them what they were going to do with the data. But according to Belgian Data Protection Authority, it violated GDPR in the process. Partly because asking for consent can be a violation of unsolicited contact. Very, very difficult to sort out. Okay? So, anyway, I got to take one of these. I had some great eggs this morning. So it's a mess, and basically all these people say it's not going to pass, and it's not going to get... They could have significantly larger fines in the new rules because big tech just laughs at it. They say it's worth more to us to violate it than it is to pay the penalties. And finally, though there was optimism, it was said they've been in office 3 years. They haven't done it yet. They're probably not going to do it. And then Europe gives final sign-off to rebooted e-commerce rules. And it wasn't clear what e-commerce rules, to me, they were changing. But the article has lots of cheering for the new content moderation and marketplace rules, but they believe that this Digital Services Act could become the gold standard for other regulators in the world. I think the good news in this is that they're trying to regulate the digital world at least a little bit. The broadcasters, radio and TV, have been regulated. The newspapers have been regulated to some extent. There are libel laws that, if they just say something incorrect, that, there is some recourse for the people that have been wronged. Whereas in the United States, the digital companies hide behind, this clause that says they can't be sued for any content on their site, which really was to protect them from posts that, where I would slander you as a member of their site, and they're not liable, and that makes some sense. But when they start booting people off for what they said when it doesn't violate any other law, they just felt like booting them off, then they start looking like they're abusing their power and need to be somehow regulated. And I think that's true. I think they should at least be treated as publishers, or if not that, as utility companies. So anyway, defenders of the European fundamental rights had wanted the DSA to go even further. So the consumer advocates didn't think it did enough. The business people thought it did too much. So it's probably getting at the issue. The next few years will thus see a major shift in how the EU regulates digital services and platform power, with attention, certainly on paper, to both economic and democratic impacts of big tech. But just because they're aimed at big tech, too many of these rules, big tech can afford the penalties and the attorneys to fight this stuff, but your average association, or like the WDMA, we have a little website. Are we violating something? Hard to know. I don't know. I know that we do have 3 cookies on there. I don't know how they got there. I didn't put them there. That's the even funnier part. You say, well, I don't want to accept any cookies. I didn't either. I just used WordPress, and poof, out it came. Anyway, so it's a complex issue. I sometimes I do articles just to sort of keep myself abreast. I did read all these articles, and I welcome your comments, certainly. How do we solve this? Big tech has clearly exercised control of their platforms with booting people off. And are they a utility? Are they a publisher? They claim they're not. They claim that they're just putting up stuff. People, they're just a space. But it seems like, if the telephone companies canceled turned off your phone because you had mentioned, that you didn't like President Obama, or you didn't like President Trump. If they started doing that, that seems to breach the public trust. So it does seem to be there's some parallel there. And they do exercise some editorial control in who they boot off and what they block. And probably they're doing much more than that in shadow banning, etc. So anyway, I welcome your comments. As I said, sometimes I read these to keep myself up to date. And as I said last week or yesterday, give me a call. Let's talk about your marketing issues. No charge. 15 minutes.